Lepore, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've been reading you for a long time. I feel like one of the themes of your work and one of the themes of a public debate for the last 10, 20 years has been, trying to figure out how to think about the United States. Is the United States a story of great triumph, a story of building one of the largest and most successful and most inclusive democracies in human history? Or is it the story of marginalization and exclusion and injustice? And it seems to me, not to put words in your mouth, that you would kind of answer something like both. Tell us about how you're thinking about this question and how that inflects your historical work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I should maybe begin by saying I certainly never started out as a historian wanting to write this kind of national account, right? Sort of being a national historian or trying to reckon with the question that you pose, how should we think about the United States? That was really never my question. I think it is an urgent public question and one that historians have generally failed to answer or even really to engage with, because of course, like these national history questions tend to be very dangerous, right? They tend to be very self-satisfied and smug, and national histories veer very easily into blood and soil nationalism, right? Trying to offer up an account of a nation's origins and its meaning and some sense of its possibility historically is just very closely associated with a kind of defensiveness about the idea of the nation. So American historians in particular, really since the 1960s, scholars of American history have not been principally engaged in asking this question. What is the meaning of the United States? How should we think about the United States and its past? That's largely been done politically, and that's what a lot of American politics revolves around, right? So we have a very hyperpolarized political discourse in this country, and to some degree, academic accounts of American history, which have generally been aligned with the left, take the position that American history can be best understood as a kind of a litany of atrocities that have never really been reckoned with fully. And popular history, which is more closely aligned with the right, takes the position that American history is the story of a march of progress and prosperity and freedom, and the United States is a beacon of liberty around the world. And those two accounts of the past, the one popular and the one academic, are not in conversation with one another at all. They are themselves the product of our hyperpolarized politics. So for me, as a historian interested in groups and conflict and social history and labor history and the history of race relations and women's history and all the other kinds of histories that were largely left out of the kinds of accounts of the American past that I was exposed to, as a kid or even in college, I just came to be really troubled by the popular account that misses all of that and therefore is just wildly impoverished. And meanwhile, the academic discourse became more and more untethered, I think, to the greatness of the American story and to the genuine promise of the United States founding ideals. So I would say I'm a quite reluctant historian of the American nation as a project. But in the 2010s, I became really concerned about the gap between these two accounts and started writing more and more about the idea of the United States, and really beginning probably with the Tea Party movement, which began in 2008, 2009 during Barack Obama's election and early presidency, which sought its legitimacy in telling a particular story about the American Revolution that was unrecognizable to me as a historian of the American Revolution. Its account of the American Revolution is bafflingly bizarre. And I did a lot of reporting. I spent a lot of time with people in the Tea Party, and it just kind of convinced me that, wow, we are responsible for this gap. We academic historians are responsible for the gap between what the public thinks about the American past and what scholars know. And so I've been trying to bridge that gap in the work that I have done. I wouldn't say it's my passion as an intellectual. Far from it. It just feels more like my duty as a citizen and as someone trying to contribute to civil society.
Well, I'm glad you feel that call of duty and that you are doing and have done that work. I mean, two thoughts on what you've said so far. One is that part of what academic history has often done is to tell, I think, a rather too simple story of, consisting of an exclusive focus on the atrocities in American history and bad sides. Part of it is simply that it isn't engaging in some of those questions, right? I was a graduate student at Harvard where you teach, and I think for a long time there wasn't a course offered in the history department, the American Revolution, for example. So there was simply no real attempt to grapple with some of those big questions in a lot of academic history. The other thing that comes to mind is a conversation I recently had in this podcast with your colleague Randall Kennedy in the law school. That what appealed to me about these truths, your one-volume history of the United States, for example, was that it was a kind of concrete demonstration of a lie that I feel very strongly from both sides of the political spectrum at the moment. And that is that sort of, in order to be patriotic and in order to have pride in America's history, you can't dwell too much on the dark sides to it on one side. And on the other side, that sort of if you want to grapple critically with the role, for example, that race and racial excuse me, with, for example, the role that race and racial exclusion has played in American history, or with the history that the exclusion of women has played in American history, then really the only way to do that is through a kind of critical race theory lens. The only way to do that is through a lens that really takes what is actually quite a modern contemporary ideology and sort of superimposes it on American history.
I guess the idea that Harvard hasn't taught a course on the American Revolution was a kind of right-wing canard for a long time. And it's just factually not true. There was no course called the American Revolution in the course catalog for a number of years, but my amazing colleague Laurel Thatcher Ulrich taught a huge general education lecture course called The Pursuit of Happiness that was about the founding and about the ideas of the founding, looking at them across the culture and across space and time. My wonderful colleague Vince Brown taught a kind of comparative revolutions course on slave rebellions in the Caribbean as against the story of the American Revolution. My then colleague Jane Kamensky, who's now the head of Monticello, taught a course on the American Revolution while she was writing her magnificent book about Copley. I taught a course that I think at some point was just called the American Revolution. That was a research course into primary source evidence accounts of Boston and the American Revolution. It's like none of these, I think they weren't legible in a course catalog way as kind of old school, like first we have the founding class, then there's American Revolution, then there's, the Industrial Revolution, then there's a Civil War class. Like they didn't look like high school courses. And someone wrote an op-ed in the New York Times complaining that, like, who are these idiots at the Harvard History Department who don't teach the American Revolution? We're all kind of baffled, like, should our course names be more legible? Like, what's the problem?
I mean, course names in general should be more legible, probably mine as well.
Right, I think that's fair to say. I think that's fair to say.
By two Harvard faculty members who were proposing to teach a course about the American Revolution, and who felt that at the time they were doing that, there were no other courses. So I get that.
I'm just saying,
some of your colleagues.
It's just one of those things that gets batted around, like, who are that just became a thing online. And I would just point out, in the new Ken Burns 12-hour series on the American Revolution, some of the most stunning, the academic historians who are the talking heads in that series, which is magnificent, are chiefly my colleagues. Phil Deloria, who also covered the American Revolution in his Native American history class, Vince Brown, Maya Jasanoff. Like, just, it really is stuff that we do teach and think about. So I don't mean to derail your critique, because I agree with a lot of the critique as a whole, but I think there's just I kind of tired of being a punching bag around things that makes no sense.
But yeah, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to pick on the Harvard History Department, of which I have fond memories from when I was a grad student. I was in the government department doing political theory, but I went along to many events in the history department and had colleagues who were PhD students there. To name another example from the university where I now teach, Johns Hopkins, there's an initiative to try and make sure that some course that undergraduates take on the way to their BA degree would need to have a democracy theme. And it could be in one of many different kinds of departments. It could have many different kinds of approaches.
Yeah.
And there's very strong resistance to this among the faculty. Now, part of that is that faculty are always going to be resistant to a university administration trying to impose anything on them, and some of this is just normal bureaucratic politics. But I do think that there is a broader concern, on which I think we agree, where we're not willing to contest some of those ideas, and then they become colonized both by people who have less expertise and by people who might have a rather more simplistic view of this. To take a completely different example, I've long felt that the ascendancy of Jordan Peterson was in many ways a failure of more moderate intellectuals, because he was willing to give very public advice to disoriented young men about how to structure and lead their lives. And again, I'm sure that there's somebody on the center right and probably even somebody on the center left who was engaged in the same enterprise, but there really was a vacuum that made it easy for somebody like Jordan Peterson to fill it. And so I do think that, in the broader, one way of putting this is that I think there is an instinct towards critique which is trying to tear something down. And that instinct, I think, made sense at a time when a deep understanding and worship for American history was a really tangible feature of American history, when every 5-year-old would learn off by heart the capitals of the American states, and there was this kind of unthinking civic pride, and so there was an understandable attempt to try and tear that down. And I worry that in this moment the sort of basic orientation, not just of history but of political science and of many academic fields, is still to sort of, let's take down this naive image and this naive reverence for things, but actually doesn't really exist anymore in society in the way that we presume.
Well, I think that's fair, and yet it is being required, right? That's what the Trump campaign of patriotic education is, right? Like it's the absence of that is now mandated by the federal government, right? So I don't rest as easy about that as maybe you do, but there's absolutely the case that a lot was evacuated from, say, the teaching of American history that Americans really need, that anybody studying in the United States, American or not, really needs. So, for instance, constitutional history used to be taught in history departments. It isn't anymore. It's not even really taught in law schools. Constitutional law is taught in law schools, which has a historical dimension in which, constitutional laws are sort of hopscotch from major Supreme Court decision to major Supreme Court decision, and therefore you come to believe that the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is, and there's no other role for any other interlocutors in interpreting or understanding or amending the Constitution. And that's a problem, right? It's a problem that history departments stopped teaching constitutional history or stopped teaching electoral political history, right? The kind of the politics that history departments generally taught for some decades was a kind of Foucauldian notion of power rather than how democracies work. So, exactly as you say, there's a kind of compensatory moment now. People are like, you know what? Actually, we do need to be teaching some things about citizenship, and there will be some requirements that history departments, some of the curricula involve explaining the origins of modern democracy. That there is resistance to that, I do, though, frankly, understand, because if it were coming from faculty and from students and was emerging from an intellectual commitment and a civic notion with regard to the role of the university, that would be great. But what it often feels like at some of these institutions is capitulation to an increasingly interfering federal government that is dictating what must be taught and who may teach it. And I think that, my guess is that even at a place like Johns Hopkins, the faculty resistance to, you must now teach democracy and cherish it with your students is this what we should be teaching because we should be teaching it, or is this what we're trying to sort of defend ourselves against further attacks from the federal government, and that's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, this initiative at Johns Hopkins started well before 2024, so it's not a reaction to Trump being reelected. But I think that does pose a deeper problem for how to think about this in universities. So I wasn't going to jump into this early in the conversation, but you recently gave a number of interviews in which you said that you were so perturbed by the rise of, for lack of a better word, woke ideas at Harvard and at other universities that you strongly considered resigning your position because the atmosphere had become sort of so unbearable. I think it does pose the question of how do we deal with some of those failings within our universities. And I worry that there was a moment in 2023, 2024, where some of those excesses and some of those shortcomings were becoming increasingly clear. And, the sort of majority of faculty or the plurality of faculty who I think are kind of center-left liberals, a bit of a progressive bend, but not, all out sort of left-wing ideologues, we're recognizing that and we're saying, okay, let's reform. And I worry that in this political moment, some of what the Trump administration does is indeed so extreme, and in particular, some of the Trump administration's attacks on universities are so extreme, that there's this kind of rallying around the flag effect, where any reform that in 2023 or 2024 you might be able to get a majority of the faculty at Harvard or Johns Hopkins or any other leading university in the United States behind, now immediately will read as either capitulation to the demands of the Trump administration or kind of preemptory obedience. But that creates a really bad dynamic where we're unwilling to fix some of the problems that we ourselves in private moments are willing to recognize, because any attempt to do so can quickly be coded and attacked as just capitulating to the Trump administration. So how do we reform the university and how do we fix some of these problems, without falling into that trap?
Yeah, I do think that's tricky. And I do think it requires being open and candid with one another. Maybe not necessarily always with the public. I'm not sure this needs to be discharged through a public forum. About failures over the last 20 years or so within higher education, which I wouldn't describe as redounding to the problems of woke ideology. There are a lot of problems with higher education that have nothing to do with woke ideology, whatever that is meant to be. That I think it has to be possible to identify those things, be honest about them, disagree about what those failings were or whether they still exist, and address them, and not have all of that be seen to be bound up with some kind of capitulation to the Trump administration. But I think that maybe that's an argument for doing that within the walls of the academy and not on a public forum, which is why I'm not the person who's out there like making a career for myself talking about, oh no, higher education was such a problem. Like, there are people that do that, right? That's like a big part of the Jordan Peterson beat, right? That the sort of exile from higher education, and in a way, the space that those characters take up in the public sphere makes it much more difficult for anyone else to speak honestly and candidly, because you kind of, I think most reasonable people fear being classed with those self-congratulatory exiles.
But so what is the problem of university in your mind? So I agree with you that there's lots of problems, like very high tuition fees, like the fact that often, renovating the gym and making sure that you have the best possible athletic facilities had a higher priority than investing in, paying, adjunct faculty members decent wages. There's all kinds of things that you can complain about the university with very good reason that have nothing to do with that. But, I don't presume that, the fact that perhaps Harvard had sometimes wrong spending priorities is the reason why you nearly resigned your job. It sounds from what you have said publicly that does have to do with a kind of intellectual atmosphere in which, at least for a few years, it was very difficult, even for somebody who's clearly left of center and who, I don't know how you self-describe politically, but who's clearly, I think, in many ways is progressive, felt unable to speak freely without fear of the kind of unpleasantness that made you think, perhaps I'd rather make a life for myself outside of academia.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it might be useful to think historically here instead of autobiographically, which I don't think is really all that fruitful. I spent a lot of time when I was working on my most recent book, that's a history of the Constitution, thinking about the life of Charles Beard, who's always been one of my intellectual heroes. Beard, whose wife, Mary Ritter Beard, was also a famous, very deservedly celebrated American historian, pioneering historian of women, had been an eminent professor at Columbia and was most famous for a book that he published in 1913, for which he was really resoundingly attacked. A book called An Economic Interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. And it really shook up. So Beard was a progressive in the old-fashioned sense, right? He was a progressive of the progressive era. He was a political historian, but also an economic historian. He was a very active progressive leader, right? So very involved in the progressive cause of the 19-teens, which chiefly involved attempts to amend the Constitution. And the progressives, in fact, succeeded. They amended the Constitution 4 times between 1913 and 1920, and Beard was involved in all of those efforts, right, which culminated in the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, which Mary Ritter Beard was also, of course, involved in. But Beard wrote this book about the Constitution in which he argued that the Constitution's origins were chiefly economic, that the framers of the Constitution were wealthy men. He spent a lot of time documenting their incomes and the source of their income, and that they had devised a constitution that protected their own property rights. It was largely read as an indictment of the Senate, which was considered the millionaires' club at the time. Before the 17th Amendment, the U.S. Senate was elected by members of the state legislatures. And you could just kind of basically bribe your way into the Senate if you had enough money. And progressives had been trying for decades and decades to get rid of the indirect election of the Senate, which had also been a feature of a lot of state constitutions, right, from at the start, and had been amended out of the state constitutions. It's like a wildly anti-democratic provision, right? Like, can't the people elect their own representatives? Isn't that the whole point? And so this has been really successfully amended out of state constitutions, but it was really difficult to get amended out of the U.S. Constitution because it had to get through the Senate. And the members of the Senate had no interest in being elected directly by the people because they all knew they would lose their jobs. So part of the way that Beard's work was really seen was as endorsing what became the 17th Amendment, right, in 1913, which progressives managed to get the Senate to finally approve the amendment to get rid of to be elected by the people by threatening to hold a constitutional convention. Anyway, so Beard had done this kind of really interesting work. And then he was very defensive about it when reviews came out and said, like, the book was attempting to amend the Constitution by writing a new history of it. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just seemed very instrumentalist to his critics, who had some pure notion of the historian who somehow doesn't live in the time in which he's writing. And he defended that. It was like, this is what I find in the archives. This is the story that I find in the archives, and I wanted to tell it. But the truth
he sort of claimed that he wasn't aiming for a political impact, even though that likely wasn't true.
Yeah, which is interesting to me because I came across when he was living in New York, he founded and was for a long time a member of like the committee to amend the federal constitution. Like he was entirely involved, like totally, like very much a political actor in a way that say like I'm not on a committee to amend the constitution. But Beard was an extremely principled person, and during the First World War, the very, very conservative president of Columbia, Nicholas Butler, who was a constitutional conservative at a time when constitutional conservatism was being founded, required that faculty sign a loyalty oath to the United States. There was so much, as you know, the U.S. entry into the war in Europe was extremely unpopular in the United States. Wilson was despised for it, and therefore, founded this Ministry of Propaganda to try to convince the American people that the Germans were evil and they needed to be stopped. Beard, who actually supported the U.S. entry into the war, really opposed the loyalty oaths. And when two of his colleagues were fired for refusing to sign the loyalty oaths, he resigned in protest. This is, I think, 1917. Right, so it's when the Sedition Act, right around Eugene Debs is being arrested, and there's a lot of repression, political repression of political dissent, repression of opposition to the war. And Beard, just as a principled matter, retired. And he was, partly because of that book he had written about the Constitution, he was by far the best-known American historian of his day. And he moved to Connecticut and raised cows. And I think a lot about what that took for Beard to leave academic life
and did
at
he
a
just
time of
leave his
political
academic
repression.
position, or did he also stop writing history? And
No, he continued writing history. He went on to write with his wife. Probably the best textbook at the time was called The Rise of American Civilization. Came out in, I think, I want to say 27. But he and his wife and he alone, they just wrote a series of textbooks. I mean, he did other intellectual work as well, and he was very involved politically. He later taught at the New School for some time. He died in, I think, 1948. So he did have some more academic life.
Right.
But I think it's a good illustration of a principled engagement with the idea of free inquiry and of higher education and of the importance of the study of the American past, especially in times of political crisis, when the trial of ideas, the world of democracy is in question. Beard wrote a beautiful essay in 1934, I think it's called The Future of American Democracy. Someone who found a way to both celebrate what universities are for and yet could not be in a university. So my point in telling this tale is that I don't think this is a new dilemma. It's not like, oh, wow, what a weird time we're living in. This is always, there's always a tension between the university and the state.
Well, but let me say two things about that. So one is that I think it's clear and obvious to me that restrictions on what people can say are driven either by top-down political demands or by the preferences and moral strictures of a particular social milieu who has captured a particular part of society, are a very regular occurrence in human history. And in fact, many of the most famous instances of moral panics that we come to regret in retrospect fall precisely into that category. So the claim certainly is not that there was something unique about the American university in 2015 or 2018 in that respect. But surely the inference of that is precisely that this is all the better reason to be very clear and upfront about the nature of that and to speak out against it. And you very elegantly answered my question with a historical metaphor. And, in the case of historical metaphors, or analogies, there's obviously always, an element that is similar and an element that is dissimilar. And you may beg that there are elements of dissimilarity here. But, didn't you answer inadvertently compare what it was like, or perhaps advertently compare what it was like to be a professor at Harvard in 2018 to what it was like to be a professor at Columbia in 1917 or in 1932, which is actually quite a striking claim to make.
Let's think of a different example. I was thinking about Francis Lieber, who is a German intellectual who immigrated to the United States in the 1820s. He's often described as the German Tocqueville, and he couldn't get a job teaching in the North, and he took a job in South Carolina, what was then South Carolina College, now is the University of South Carolina, I believe. And he was an abolitionist, and he tried for decades to get out of South Carolina, and yet he became an owner of slaves. He owned other human beings. He wrote in his diary about these purchases. Not like a large plantation owner, but he had a number of women that worked as domestics in human bondage in his service, and he doesn't really manage to get out of South Carolina until after Dred Scott. I think Dred Scott, which is the 1857 decision of the Supreme Court that rules that no Black American can ever be a citizen of the United States. He managed to get out. He goes to Columbia, where he proceeds to deliver a series of lectures on the Constitution, renouncing secession. And it's a really interesting story because you see someone who had wholly compromised a deeply held principle, right? That his opposition, he wasn't like an anti-racist or something, but he was opposed to human bondage, and yet he participated in it, and he wrote these sort of private letters to John C. Calhoun that he was unwilling to publish, and he just let himself be completely suppressed as an intellectual by essentially what we would describe as the academic job market. Like, he just couldn't get a job.
Right.
He couldn't get and he largely couldn't get a job, I believe, because he was Jewish, although that was this sort of contentious. Anyway, then he goes to Columbia. He has this real blossoming, and he gives these series of lectures that are widely published in newspapers. Lincoln then hires him to write he writes famously the Lieber Code, which is the basis of the Geneva Code. It is the laws of war that the United States adopts during the Civil War. So he has this kind of late stage career in which he, I think, considers himself to be acting in accordance with his principles. But it's a counterexample to Beard's, in my mind, in terms of the relationship between the intellectual sort of complicity with the ideological position of the state versus one's own commitment to ideas and the freedom of ideas.
Well, I want to get into the history of the Constitution and your latest book in a moment, but just a final question on this. I mean, what lessons do you take from this contrast between Lieber and Beard for what it means to be true to yourself as an intellectual at a time when there's tremendous pressures on you, and whether that is being an intellectual who wants to defend a substantive notion of liberal democracy in Hungary at a time when big parts of the state, increasingly the academic system, are captured by loyalists to Viktor Orban, or perhaps if you're an intellectual who has, or an academic who has certain views disfavored by their colleagues, in the American Academy in 2018.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I obviously wrestled with that a lot over the last years, and I think I have failed to live up to my own principles. So far be it for me to suggest what those principles can and ought to be for anyone else, and how they ought to honor them. I would say, you obviously can tell I don't really want to talk about this. I'd much rather talk about the work. But just to finish up this point, for me, there were many tough moments, but one tough moment was when some students in a class I was teaching said they wouldn't read the Dred Scott opinion, this 1857 Supreme Court decision by the Chief Justice Roger Taney, which is, considered one of the worst, if not the worst, opinion ever issued by the Supreme Court. It's.
And I'm sure your goal in teaching it was not to defend it.
My goal in teaching was surely not to defend it, but the assignment was to engage in a debate in section over the question of whether the U.S. Constitution did or did not sanction slavery, based on a series of readings on that question from the 1850s, which included writings by Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, Frederick Douglass, and then the Dred Scott decision. I remember just sitting in my office thinking, I don't really feel like it's my job to explain that you have to read historical documents even if you don't like them. Like that just seemed like the most elementary piece of work for being a human in the world. Like I guess I kind of prepared something I might say, you know, bring these students into office hours and say, here's the thing I want to explain. And I just was mad. Like, who told these people that it was, you could just say, I don't want to read that because I find it painful. Because if that's how you feel, then you can't read history. History is full of pain. People suffer. Literature is full of pain. Philosophy is full of pain. The human experience is full of pain and suffering and injustice. And to gain any capacity to live a good life, you have to confront pain, injustice, and suffering and find a way to think about it and reckon with it and remedy it and make amends for it. Like, to not engage with, like, I was like, if this is what my job is reduced to, right, is saying you actually have to do the reading, what am I doing? Like, so I think that is a good encapsulation. When I say I found it extremely difficult, sure, there's the firings, there's all kinds of nonsense going on, like a lot of day-to-day, like, and this happened, how could this have happened? Why did the deans allow this to? But there was, at a core of it, there was that, and I honestly, these are very young people. I don't blame them. Whatever they brought, they didn't get this from me. They got this somewhere. And yet they feel it with such tenacity. For me, that's different than Charles Beard's problem, right? That's different than Francis Lieber's problem. That's really not even about the university at all.
Yeah, that's perhaps more similar to what Theodor Adorno faced in 1968 when his students had decided that he was actually a terrible reactionary and so started protesting his lectures, etc. Right? I mean, pressure from students is a different thing from pressure from administrators. I mean, the thing that bugs me about this kind of response is that, you know, if somebody says, I just want to devote my life to thinking about pleasant things and I just want to read pretty love stories, you know, that's not my choice, but I think that's a coherent choice, right? You know, if you just love beauty and you want to look at pretty pictures and read nice novels, I think that's sort of misunderstanding what the most important pictures in the history of art and what some of the most moving novels that have been written by humans are, but fair enough, you know, like there's worse ways of spending a life. What's sort of so strange and contradictory about this is the sort of parallel insistence that we want to have a very negative view of the world and we want to claim that we're fighting against injustice and suffering of every kind, but we don't want to grapple with its actual historical and contemporary nature, because, you know, we're not going to read the text. That's sort of what's strange about it. You know, I find, you know, and I promise that's the last question in this direction I want to ask you, that there was a zeal that some students, it was never a majority of students, but that some students brought to the classroom where they wanted to impose a certain view. It wasn't just, I personally don't want to read this text. It sent the message that you're a bad person for wanting us to read this text, right? There was an implicit threat on it. And I haven't found that anymore in the last few years. I don't know if you agree with that, but there's something that I find has changed in the mentality of the students, where perhaps precisely, and it's not that they don't believe in some of those ideas at all anymore, perhaps it's that it went from feeling to them like an organic movement of their generation to something that they've been kind of taught by the culture, or by parts of the culture at least, since elementary school or since middle school or since high school, and it's kind of the ideas of the adults, and even if they believe in them, it doesn't have the same fervency. But I just wonder whether you've felt that shift among the students in the last years as well.
Yeah, I do think that it is the case that the students are less prosecutorial, in the sense, less prosecutorial of one another, which was really the most painful thing to see, right? Like, I can take it, but they are very young to be just snapping at each other and recording each other in class and saying, you know, shaming one another. There's much less of that. I think that the you know, the inclination to take a critical stance on the syllabus, I mean, that's as old as the hills, right?
Sure.
There's always going to be, why didn't you include this, and why did you not include that? And yeah, it's going to change from year to year what they think should be included and what shouldn't be included. But yeah, there's not zeal is a good word for it. There's a little bit less of the zeal and satisfaction, or the sense that is the only kind of intellectual work worth doing, right? That I think it was the narrowness of that.
Let's get to the U.S. Constitution, which you talk about in your latest book. There's something paradoxical about the Constitution, where it's, in some ways the most successful political document, arguing the history of mankind. I mean, it set up a vast continental republic that is about to celebrate its 250th anniversary. Is today the most, or one of the two most powerful countries in the world. It has survived largely unchanged, over a time period in which other countries, including other relatively successful democracies, have gone through 10, 20, 30 different constitutional documents. And at the same time, when you look at American politics today, it can feel as though some of the stuckness that animates the political divisions that we see, the political frustrations that are one of the contributing reasons why people feel compelled to vote for someone like Donald Trump. All of that seems to also derive in some ways from the difficulty and from the stickiness of that document. So how, as a historian, are you thinking about the successes and the limitations of this document?
I think that Americans have, on the whole, relative to other people of other nations, a great deal of veneration for the Constitution that is based partly just on a cultural predisposition, but also is founded in its longevity, which is extraordinarily unusual. Globally, the average lifespan of a constitution is 19 years. Other nation states revise and replace their constitutions all the time. And I think a lot of Americans attribute American prosperity and prominence and stability to the Constitution, without necessarily knowing exactly why, or maybe what the mechanism is by which the Constitution is providing that stability. I think it's often just assumed. And although state constitutions in the U.S. much more closely resemble the constitutions of nation states, because our state constitutions are revised and replaced all the time. Not so much replaced anymore, but there have been more than 200 state constitutional conventions. My home state, Massachusetts, has the oldest written constitution still in effect. It was adopted in 1780, but it's been amended more than 100 times. A lot of Americans don't even know they have state constitutions. Even when the ballot questions come around that are amendments to the state constitutions, I think it's not always clear what that is. Like, am I passing a
right? I understand that's
pass
changed,
a law?
But is
it statute? What is it? Yeah. But I, you could say, look, the state constitutions work better, right? Like, people have a better relationship with their state governments right now, I think, than they do. Probably, I think this is a fair statement. I don't know. I'm sure there's a political science literature on this that I have not consulted, and maybe it goes against this theory. But I think people have a fairly
and some of the most contentious questions are at the national level rather than the state level.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, also all of our questions have been nationalized.
Right.
Because we have a nationalized politics because of changes in the media environment. So I don't know. But I think that one thing that Americans don't feel about the U.S. Constitution is that they are the authors of it, and yet they are, right? That is the whole principle of our constitutional system. That this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Lincoln said. And he was summarizing the Declaration of Independence, but he was also constitutionalizing the Declaration of Independence. Like, that was Lincoln's chief contribution as a political thinker, is to take these ideas that came from black abolitionists who were, attempting to merge the Declaration of Independence with the Constitution. So I think it's part of the culture of veneration, which seems, maybe healthy. It certainly veers into unhealthy, in that Americans don't have a sense of their own political capacity as citizens to themselves interpret or amend the Constitution. I mean, they do at certain times, in eras when the Constitution is being amended by the people, so which has happened in bursts at different moments in time, but it hasn't happened really, say, in our lifetimes, right? 1971 is the last time the U.S. Constitution was meaningfully amended. That's a long drought. So to the point where I don't think most Americans know the U.S. Constitution can be amended, or have a vision for what they would want if they knew that it could. And I think that's an impoverishment of our political discourse. And I also think the fact that we no longer hold state constitutional conventions, which again used to be very frequent. The last full constitutional convention was held in Rhode Island in 1986. I think those convenings I don't think like a lot of great stuff comes out of them necessarily, but I think the convening, like just knowing your state is like you're electing delegates to go revise the state constitution, is a kind of civic renewal, and it relies on a capacity for exercising the skills of democratic citizenship that I don't think we have really. I think a lot of those skills have atrophied, so that I spent a lot of time talking to different audiences around the country about this book, and people would say, well, are you arguing we should have another constitutional convention, like a federal constitutional convention? Isn't that dangerous? Isn't that going to be like, then we'll have a MAGA constitution? I'm like, well, I kind of think we already have a MAGA. Like, whatever. I'm not making an argument what we should or should not do. I often put it to people, and I say, like, if trial by jury had been just put on a shelf in 1971, like we just decided, there were a lot of efforts to say, like, there are other methods that are going to be more fair. You could have at this point, you could have AI do it, right? The lie detector was invented in the 1920s to replace trial by jury, right? Like there's so many problems with jury results, and lawyers hate juries, and so we had just decided, and imagine we just decided.
There's currently a proposal by the Labour government in Britain to abolish juries for all but the most serious criminal cases.
Yeah. So there's a lot of anti-jury sentiment in the legal community, right? So imagine, just as a counterfactual, that in 1971 this had succeeded, and so there was no more trial by jury for any kind of trial in the U.S. And then imagine that in 2025 somebody said, I think we should bring back trial by jury. Would anybody support that? And I think I put this to an audience, and people were like, no one would support that. Like 12 random people are going to decide whether my son is guilty of something, or my daughter, should be awarded this compensation. And that's sort of how I feel about amending the Constitution or the people's capacity to hold a convention. We have just accepted that we are passive in the face of this. There are better modes, that people in power are better positioned, and in this case, the people in power, the Supreme Court, to do this work. And yet, I will say I am a huge fan of trial by jury. I think it's part, not because I think it necessarily leads to the most just and fair outcomes. I think the literature on that, I haven't really inspected it, but I'm sure there are reasons to be doubtful and to think it might be better to have judges or make more of these decisions. But going and not being called for a jury is just a civic experience, and the development of a capacity of citizenship. Even watching the little video where they explain what your job is going to be on the jury, it's like one of the few times that we still gather as citizens with a faith in our capacity to deliberate together reasonably in the face of competing strands of evidence and come to a true conclusion. Like, that's a beautiful idea. We could give up on that, and we could give up on the idea that we have the right to consent to be governed in the form of amending our own Constitution. But then the democracy is just going to elections every 2 or 4 years. It's like right. Being like a Christmas and Easter Catholic. I don't get it.
So look, I agree with you strongly about jury trials and their importance. I also agree that there are many concerning things that come out of effectively having made it impossible to amend the Constitution. There's a broader political science literature about semi-presidentialism, which argues that when the president and Congress usually have different majorities, that might seem like it's a great protection for democracy because it makes it incredibly hard to make any political changes, including changes that would restrict democratic rights. But in practice, the gridlock that this leads to has really negative effects. And eventually people get so frustrated that they might become more willing to vote for a strongman who says, none of this is working, give me the trust to do something about it. And I think that in a parallel vein, I'm sort of arguing by analogy here, you might think that a constitution that is really rigid best preserves our liberties, because you can't have a small majority of deputies who happen to win one election go and abolish the First Amendment or abolish certain basic rights that we have. Certainly right in this political moment. I'm quite glad that it is hard to make political changes in the United States, because it does provide some constraints on what Trump can do in the White House. But in fact, it also has lots of negative political impacts, one of which is that 9 unelected judges become the de facto interpreters and to some extent writers of a constitutional order. That popular majorities continue to feel frustrated, because even if they have a strong preference that goes against what those 9 judges believe the Constitution to have said, they're really unable to make their voices heard. And so perhaps that leads to a lot of the frustration and dysfunction and polarization of our society. I find all of that very plausible. So I think, as often in the realm of politics, you're faced with a real trade-off here, the trade-off of wanting some surety against the ability of changeable political majorities just having their will imposed immediately, and the fact that if you, in fact, introduce too many veto points, and America has more veto points than virtually any other democracy in the world, then actually the very thing you're trying to guard against might be hastened by it. Explain to me, though, why it is that we feel that there's been a change, because Britain is considering putting forward legislation to abolish jury trials, but we haven't changed the mechanism by which we amend the Constitution. The mechanism is the same as it always was, and yet, as you point out, we haven't had a constitutional amendment since 1971, so for over 50 years. And you'll know the exact historical dates better than I do. As you pointed out, there is constitutional amendments have historically come in bursts, so they tend to cluster around certain moments when there is a widely felt need for change. But I don't know if there had been a 50-year period before 1971 in which there was no constitutional amendments at all. So why is it that even though we haven't abolished our ability to make constitutional amendments, not like we changed the mechanism, it has now become so difficult? And is the way to change that social, political? Would you be in favor of a constitutional amendment that makes it easier to amend the Constitution? Like if we take that as seriously as a concern as you do, what does that mean about what we should do?
Yeah, I'm just trying to run the math in my head. This is not the longest constitutional amendment drought. So the 12th Amendment is 1803 and the 13th is 1865. But of course, those were years when the thing that most Americans were fighting about constitutionally was slavery, and they were unable to, there's no way an amendment could have addressed that, right? It led to a civil war, right? It would have been healthier if there were a series of amendments that could have addressed it. But that paralysis, which is the paralysis during which the Supreme Court assumed the authority, which is not written into the Constitution, to overturn laws of Congress by declaring them unconstitutional. It's that era in which the authority of the judiciary becomes supreme, is really a function of the failure of Americans to amend the Constitution and solve the problem of slavery by peaceable means, right? The amendment mechanism of the Constitution, Article 5, is there in order to avert insurrection. The idea that a founding idea that came from the state constitutions was, we've just been through this bloody revolution. We're going to write down our Constitution, unlike England. We're going to write it down. When we write it down, it's going to be, the risk is it's going to be fixed and too brittle. And so we have to have a mechanism to change it. It has to be challenging, difficult to change it, but it can't be impossible. Or else the only way to fundamentally change the government, the structure of government, will be by revolution. And that's what they were trying to avoid. So they came up with what they thought was just this brilliant notion, this peaceable means. to improve, to make amends, to correct, to repair, to adjust, to modernize, whatever, so many meanings of amendment. And to your point, it immediately didn't work because there were questions that Americans couldn't solve by the mechanism of Article 5, given sectionalism and given the party system, neither of which really existed. Well, I mean, I guess you didn't call it sectionalism. Obviously, there were huge sectional tensions that underlie the compromises of the Constitution, but the party system didn't exist. So and it's
the most under-theorized part of every modern constitutional order. I mean, you read the great founders of modern democracy, and people don't really reckon with the existence of political parties.
Yeah.
Because they didn't exist.
1787, there are no political parties in the United States. Political parties are antithetical to republicanism. Factionalism is what will destroy a republic. Of course, there will never be political parties in our country. Therefore, when we put into this Constitution these double supermajority requirements, an amendment has to pass a 2/3 supermajority in both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the state. This is difficult, but it's not impossible. But then it becomes impossible. It becomes extremely difficult because the party system emerges by 1800. So our modern era of hyperpolarization begins around 68, 1968. 1972, the ERA passes Congress, goes to the states. It's part of the set of issues that is further polarizing the United States, and then, of course, it is not ratified, although there are people who would debate whether, in fact, it is, in a de facto sense, ratified. So, why can't the Constitution be amended now? It's polarization. And I think I worked with YouGov, the polling people, and the organization More in Common, which is a tremendously important research outfit, a few years ago in 2022 to do some polling around if you could amend the Constitution by national popular vote. Like, would you agree to this, and this? And it turned out there really wasn't that much that Americans, even if it was like a simple majority national popular vote, there wasn't that much that Americans could do. The kind of big issues that people were really divided on, they were too divided on to execute an amendment. That's to say, like, that's going from zero. Like, let's say you wanted to propose an amendment to abolish birthright citizenship. That would be a movement, and of course, there in many ways has been a movement since about 1994, that's the first time a member of Congress introduced into Congress an amendment to the Constitution to abolish birthright citizenship. There has been a kind of movement around that, but because that's never going to get by way of Article 5 amendment, there's no chance that Americans would amend birthright citizenship out of the Constitution. It is not something Americans want. As you say, sort of the insurrectionary attempt to do that by non-Article 5 means has been incredibly destabilizing. And, we have masked agents of the federal government pulling people out of preschool rooms and throwing them into unmarked vehicles, shipping them out of the country to a place they've never been before. Like, that is what happens when we don't have the actual popular debate. There's no attempt to bring to the people this question in a meaningful way.
So, how do we think about the promise of constitutional politics? I mean, certainly if we say that we are collectively self-governing, but effectively we're governed by a document which was written 250 years ago or so, and which, we know we're not realistically able to change, in part because of our divisions. It's not God-given, it's a fact that we can't agree on things to such an extent that we would be able to amend it. But as you're rightly pointing out, it has effectively just dropped off as a form of our politics. I mean, whenever I have a student who writes an essay saying, we should have this constitutional amendment to do that, I sort of roll my eyes, because I think that's never going to happen, right? It's not that it's an unreasonable thing to want, depending on what exactly the suggestion is. It's just that, as a political cause, it just seems quixotic because of those background conditions you're talking about. Now, on the other hand, of course, I do think that there is a danger in politics of trying to blame the Constitution or the difficulty of changing the Constitution for things that actually have relatively little to do with it, which really are rooted in deep disagreements about what the country should look like. And perhaps the best example of this is the last years of political history of Chile, where which in the transition from the Pinochet regime ended up having a kind of amended version of a constitution that was written in the latter years of that regime, and so it both is historically it both feels historically illegitimate because it still has that whiff of the Pinochet years, and there's an argument that some of the provisions in the constitution, including some relatively mild supermajority requirements for certain forms of social spending, are sort of really the reason why a lot of popular political causes aren't being realized. And so there ended up being a constitutional convention, which elected very left-wing set of people to write a new constitution, and that constitution ended up being so unpopular that it was voted down by the people, and then there was a new constitutional convention. I may be flubbing the details here, but I think that's broadly right, which elected a very right-wing set of people, and they wrote a constitution that really was meant to appeal to the political right, and it was voted down, I don't know whether by a larger margin or a smaller margin, but by a similar margin, I think, and now Chile is back to having the old constitution. And so, would you be excited about a constitutional convention in the United States? Do you think that this is something that could lead to a productive form of politics, or would it just be a particularly visible stage on which Lauren Boebert and whoever else could grandstand and shout at each other, and in the end we'd either pass a bunch of crazy stuff or we wouldn't pass anything at all, because that convention wouldn't be able to gather the majorities it would require for us to agree on a different layout of a constitution.
Yeah, so I don't mean to just fob this off, but I'm really not a policymaker. I don't have a prescription here, and I think it's worse than useless to offer prescriptions when you are not a policy person who thinks about policy. My sense is that we don't really have the civic capacity right now to hold a constitutional convention that would be fair and that would lead to changes that could succeed at ratification. That, you have to run before you walk, but you also have to get out of bed before you can walk. And I feel like, for most Americans, national politics or their engagement with constitutionalism involves following stuff on social media and maybe voting. And that's kind of the best case. That I think, you kind of need to get off your ass a bit and be involved in, does my city need a new charter? Should my town revise the town codes around public accommodation or something? Like I think people need to be involved in their neighborhoods, in their towns, in their cities, and build back civic capacity, face-to-face civic capacity before, in the Tocquevillian 1830s sense of just people argue about everything all the time face to face, and they're constantly revising their city charters. Or I think we would need to build back that before I would be optimistic about the outcome of a constitutional convention, which I have no opposition to. I just don't. I think with you, or I take from your comments, this is your disposition as well. This doesn't seem likely to be a super great democratic success, given the conditions on the ground at the moment.
Is there a pattern in which it takes a very deep crisis, and it takes, to some extent, moving beyond that crisis to have a moment of constitutional renovation? So, right now we're in the crisis. And so it really doesn't feel likely. Now, if ever there was a moment, perhaps because the MAGA movement really does damage democracy to such an extent that there's a popular revulsion against it, and there's a post-Trump moment in which people sort of come together and say, "Hang on a second, this really took us in the wrong direction." I'm not sure how likely that is, by the way, or how soon that would come, but assuming something like that, where would then be the political space to say, all right, we've been through this thing, we recognize that we went down a road where we didn't want to go down. We have these few years of relative political consensus. Let's come together and think about some of the changes we need in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I honestly think I think I have a greater sense that that's possible than you do. Like, there is a window of opportunity around when it becomes possible to amend the Constitution, and quite a lot can get done. I mean, the fear is that stuff that will get done would be bad, but that's democracy, right? You risk losing when you put something to a popular vote. But I think that, in large part, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, which is to say, if we want to imagine the Constitution being different, or imagine that we are the authors of it, which really actually we have to have a better and much broader sense of the history of the Constitution that isn't just a series of Supreme Court decisions, but is the history of the struggles of Americans who are left out of the Constitution to get back into it, to get into it. And that is a really illuminating and I think quite inspiring history for all the setbacks and all the real deep challenges there. And I think there are plenty of models for really effective constitution making in the United States today. And I would point, in this case, to indigenous nations who have been engaged in a wave of constitutional conventioning and amending and drafting really since the early 1970s and, the kind of the American Indian movement, and when people in native nations decided to revise constitutions that they wrote in the 1930s as part of FDR's Indian New Deal. There are just some really interesting constitutional experiments going on in those constitutions, and those conventions have been really vital and important for those polities. So I think there's a lot of room to find inspiration. Not every story is Chile. You would think, for instance, of Ecuador, right? The Ecuador 2008 Constitution, which provided for the first time for the rights of nature, which actually has been upheld by the Constitutional Court of Ecuador. And, the oil companies tried to get it junked just this year with a referendum on, should we have a constitutional convention? They wanted to rewrite the Constitution for a bunch of reasons, but they really wanted to get rid of the rights of nature provision. And the people rejected it.
I have a question about the history of history, as it were. As we said at the beginning of this conversation, we're at a moment of very deep division about the nature of American history, whether it's a story of great triumph, whether it's a story of unmitigated disaster or something in between. How anomalous is the extent of disagreement about American history in American history? 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, were there similar divisions, or were the divisions that undoubtedly existed similarly strong, and did they take up a similarly big part of a political debate? And what might that tell us about whether this moment itself is likely to be an aberration, and in 50 or 100 years we might have a more mainstream or consensual view of what American history symbolizes, with smaller voices that contested, or is the amount of cacophony about this actually what we should expect?
I think this is a slightly more intense version of a climate that the United States just has been in, right? This is a weather pattern in an existing climate, and that climate is one in which our politics operates by having proxy disputes over the meaning of American history. And in different eras, that looks differently. I think for a long time you could have said, oh, the left really likes the Civil War and the right likes the American Revolution. You would probably still say that, right? Like that's broadly true. There's a kind of a famous...
Yeah, I'm sure that if I'm trying to think of this as a political scientist. I think if you somehow had data on how many books people have bought about each of those two different historical events, it probably I mean, most Americans
Yeah.
would not have bought a book
Yeah.
on either.
Yeah, right.
But among the Americans who have bought, at least 5 books, on one or the other, I'm sure that the people who mostly bought books about the Civil War are somewhat more likely to have voted Democrat, and the people who've mostly bought books about the American Revolution would be somewhat more likely to have voted Republican.
Yeah. So there, there's that. And then there's also, there have been these extraordinary moments of scholars, brilliant scholars, contesting a consensus narrative. So Beard in 1913, talking about the poor. Like, what about the poor white man who's completely left out of this Constitution? It was really a conspiracy of moneyed elites, right? Or think of W.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, 1935, right? Unsettling, just completely repudiating the utter travesty and fraud that was the interpretation of the Civil War by the Dunning School that said that the Civil War was just about states' rights, right, and had nothing to do with slavery, right? Du Bois just eviscerates that argument, and this is an extraordinary piece of scholarship. Or Vine Deloria, 1969, Custer Died for Your Sins, right? Just it's a whole, kind of like a little bit like the Ned Blackhawk Rediscovery of America book that came out last year, right? Retelling the story of American history from the point of view of indigenous people and indigenous nations. There have been, there's a world of novelists who do this work, right? You could think of kind of keystone texts of Asian American literature and fiction, or you could think of, Adrienne Rich Diving into the Wreck, like a poem that really kind of insists on the women's history, the role of the domestic, private lives. There's just incredible work that challenges what the kind of default, which is a kind of complacency, a defense of the status quo, a refusal to extend political equality and rights to people who have not had them in the past, right? Supreme Court decisions can be read as these historical texts, right? Which either we must defer to the history and tradition of this country in which many people were disenfranchised or weakly enfranchised, but that's okay because that's the history and tradition of this country, versus we must think progressively about how to extend the promise of the Constitution. So sure, we're always going to be having these arguments. That is that's the gasoline in the engine that is American history and law and politics. But that doesn't, the fact that we're always in this debate doesn't mean it's trivial or overdetermined. Like, every time it happens, it matters.
To ask a different but related question, one in the same mode, I suppose. There's a debate about how concerned to be about this political moment, even within political science, from people who think that we're really at the verge of losing the basic institutions of the American Republic, to some people who say that, actually some of the key hallmarks of democratic decline haven't been true in the United States and haven't been true in most other countries. And most other democracies around the world. There's an interesting paper by Andrew Little and Mounk arguing that actually on all of the objective hallmarks of democratic performance, the world is not looking as bad as the sort of opinion pages of some of our leading newspapers might suggest. How are you thinking about this as an historian? It clearly can't be the case that we're the most polarized we've ever been because there was the Civil War, but it certainly does feel like we're at a particularly polarized moment. We clearly are in the midst of a very serious contestation over the rules of a democratic game, which is unusual in American history, but perhaps the period of Andrew Jackson was comparable or worse. I don't know. How as a historian are you sort of trying to bring some perspective to this very urgent question about the politics of 2025?
Yeah, I was recently asked, do you remember the med beds thing? Did you hear about, does this even pass your consciousness?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, well, there was this just stray tweet or truth posted by our president about, these med beds were coming, these beds that you would heal everyone instantly in these hospitals and everyone would get a med bed card, and it's a QAnon thing.
Huh.
and he posted an AI video, a faked video in which he's on Fox News, and they're announcing that the MedBed cards are available now. So I was asked, like, is there any precedent for this in American political history? I was like, this is the screwiest assignment I've ever been. Of course, there's no, like, why is that the question, right? Like, is there precedent for this, or are we in unprecedented times? So I have a kind of allergic reaction to that question. But I wrote an essay, it was published in the New Yorker a few weeks ago, trying to explain why that is the wrong question. But like, I understand why journalists ask it and why it's kind of journalistic tick. It's not, that's not the question you were exactly asking, but I think it is the use to which journalists most frequently put historians. You know, is this as bad as the Depression? Are we eating our shoes yet? You know, is this like that question? Like, was Obama really like FDR? Is he the new FDR? Are we in the New Deal? In which everything has to. This is a good example. Would be my deferring your question about my life to talking about Charles Beard, right? Like, historians would always rather talk about dead people. So I get that, and for me, maybe just because when journalists started calling me up was probably around the Bush v. Gore moment. And it was, is this unprecedented, or where's this 1876? You know, tell us about the Electoral Count Act. Like, just what, like, and I remember, like, for years and years and years, I was so sanguine. I was like, this is a dumb question. Of course, there's a precedent for this. Like, there's a lot of comfort to be found in history. Like, things sucked in the past. Like, your children died, and you toothache caused you to kill yourself in the head with a gun. Like, I just
one of my great comforts when I despair about the state of public debate, also among intellectuals and academics, is to read George Orwell. In part because you realize that intellectuals were always tribal and small-minded and so on. So there is something about having that historical perspective.
So for me, the whole, like, I was like, history's easy, because history, you're like, it's always a solace, because things, you could always find something that was a hell of a lot worse. Like, I have medical care. I didn't die in pregnancy. Like, but what really kind of turned the dial for me was the insurrection on January 6th in 2021, which I remember watching on TV live, because I was watching with one of my kids who had a civics assignment just to watch the stupid certification of the Electoral College. Like, Jesus Christ, what's happening? But I remember sitting there, like, getting all these emails and texts, like, is this unprecedented? And I was like, yeah, this is actually, we are now far from shore. Like, this is a new era in American, let's just stop. Like, could we please stop asking this question? Because this is precedented in the histories of other countries. So, you could be calling someone who's a historian of another country, but I don't think you can get anything helpful out of an American historian in explaining. You could explain the origins of it, but not, you could not seek comfort in American history for the insurrection. And I do sort of feel like everything since that moment, really is, we're out to sea. So is that, we're doomed? No, but I don't think anybody has sight of shore right now.
Lepore, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.